Well, hi, and thank you once again for listening to Unstoppable Mindset. We're really glad you're here. We're having a lot of fun doing this. It's been going on since August of 2021. I've enjoyed every episode. I've gotten to learn a lot from all of our guests. I value that greatly. I hope that you have as well. And we have another one today, another exciting guest, Peter Bacon down in Australia, who is involved very seriously in the whole issue of disability employment. And I guess you got started, Peter, because somebody said it's all about having cups of tea and helping people. I want to hear about that. But Peter,
Yeah,
welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
thanks, Michael. Glad to be here.
So, what kind of tea?
I think it was English breakfast tea.
Ah,
Uh,
I love PG Tips.
yeah, that's high quality tea. My great grandfather used to be a salesman for Yorkshire tea, so I should probably give a shout out to Yorkshire tea.
Ah, I've heard of Yorkshire tea. I haven't tried it, but people have recommended that I should try that too. But we have a relative, a cousin who teaches at the University of Manchester, and she came over to visit us when I was living, my wife and I were in New Jersey, and she brought a British care package, and there were biscuits in it and other things, and there was a box of PG Tips tea, and we both fell in love with it. It was hard to get in the US at the time. We found a place where we could mail order it some. And then when we moved back to California after September 11th, we found a market that had literally what they called a British aisle. And on the British aisle, they sold PG Tips tea. And then we discovered that Amazon carried it. So I get PG Tips tea pretty inexpensively now and love it. So I have it every day.
Sounds like you're quite the aficionado. I mean, being a Brit living in Australia, there are similar things like this. You know where the British Isles are in terms of within the supermarkets. Also, there's various Facebook groups which relate to these things. I'm not that bothered about most of those things, but I do quite like milk chocolate digestive, so I always buy them if I see them.
There you go. Yeah, well, that makes sense too. Well, I've always enjoyed PG Tips tea. It's a lot of fun. When I wrote Thunderdog, I don't know whether you've read it, the book about me and Roselle in the World Trade Center. I even mentioned it in there. So I don't mind promoting PG Tips tea. It's good tea.
I think they need to get you on payroll, Michael.
They should. Well, I'm trying. Yeah, by that time, I'm trying to remember. I think we had discovered it. I don't know whether we had discovered it through Amazon, but it's like $20 and I get a twin pack. Each pack holds 260 or 280 bags. So it's 560 bags of tea for $20. So that now that Karen has passed away, that lasts me, a long time. It's 280 days every year. So it takes a while to go through it because it goes faster than that because I make a pot. I put 2 bags in a pot and I drink a whole pot in the course of the morning. And then I don't drink any of it the rest of the day. I drink water the rest of the day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're big on our caffeine here in Australia, Melbourne particularly. It's one of the things when I go back home to Britain and drink the coffee, I can't cope at all because the coffee's so good in Melbourne. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a big
Well,
bonus about living there.
there you go. The caffeine has never done anything for me. It's really for me all about it being hot. But I like PG Tips over just having hot water. So that's what I have. But the caffeine has never done anything more for me. I could drink a cup at night and it wouldn't make a difference. But
For me, I've got 2 young kids, so it's an important part of my life.
well, there, see, are they going to grow up to be tea drinkers?
I don't know. I've already taught my elder one, who is 10. I've taught her how to use the coffee machine at home, which is like a proper coffee machine. So she's at the very least she's a trainee barista, which would be a good job for her when she gets to sort of 16 or 17, I think.
Well, if it's a good coffee machine, it'll make hot chocolate too.
You can use it.
There you
You don't
go.
have
See. Well, tell me a little about the younger Peter, the early Peter growing up and all that, if you would.
Yeah, so I was brought up in a place called Royal Tunbridge Wells in Kent in England. Um, and it was, I wasn't necessarily that much of I did okay academically. I wouldn't say I was that much of a happy child. Um, and a lot of that was down to I was am dyspraxic. And like so many things, uh, education wants people to fit nicely into boxes, and I didn't
Mhm.
fit nicely into a box. I was, all my school reports said bright but disorganized. Um, the reports from my board might say the same thing now, but
Well, they
essentially,
they keep you hired still, though.
yeah, I have people who help me, um,
Oh, there
but
you are.
and I had systems that I do things in my head to get over those kind of things. But I wasn't, that was a struggle for me because it was that thing of, well, what is causing this? And obviously, I got a diagnosis when I was 16, about 15, 16, that I was dyspraxic, and then suddenly everything made sense. And I thought, well, that's why I'm struggling. That's why I'm finding it hard to organize myself. Um, but also, um, and there were some important lessons that I learned through that period, some of which we may touch on later. Um, but also, I was, pretty well fired up with a sense of social justice, and where that came from. Probably the way I was brought up with my family and all those kind of things. And I went to university to study politics and did okay there. And I came out with this idea that I wanted to do a job that made the world a better place. That was really what I was looking for. And I thought, well, I know what I'll do. I'll go into politics. You've got an opportunity to make the world better if you're in politics. So that's what I did. I went and worked for the Liberal Democrats, did jobs in sort of policy campaigns for about a year, 18 months. And after that period, I went, well, I don't think I'm going to make my difference here. I really struggled with it.
Yeah.
Because actually it was, you had an idealized sort of West Wing idea of what politics is like in your
Mhm.
head. But actually, most of the time, it's just about, well, what's going to win us the next election?
Which is so
Um,
sad that it's that way these days.
yeah, and maybe on some level, it's what's going to win us the next election because we have the better ideas that we can implement, and that's going to make the world a better place. But I struggled to find that.
Yeah.
I also struggled to find. I've also really struggled with the idea of, you have your party line, and you have to just parrot that, and you have to support your political party uncritically. The same way that you would your sports team. And well, actually, I'm quite critical of my sports teams, but you know, I struggled with that too. The idea that actually your ideas weren't worth much if they weren't part of the party line. So I searched for something else to do. Um, and I had a friend, and she was working as what they called an employment advisor in East London for a company called Aegis. And she said, well, Pete, this is a bit different, but there's a job over here where what you do is you sit down with people, you make and drink cups of tea, and you try and help them. You try and help them find a job, you try and help them in their lives. And I said, well, I'll give that a go because at least I know I can drink tea. so,
There you go.
so I've got half the job. So that's how I sort of started, slightly cluelessly, naively, all those kind of things. That's how I started my career in disability employment. And it's with a few variations where I've been since.
So what did you start out doing, or how did all of that work for you?
So I started out on a contract called Pathways to Work. So it was a government service that was contracted out to a bunch of different organizations, some for profit, some not for profits. Um, and it was essentially about helping people with what they called health conditions. So people who were claiming government benefits by virtue of the fact they had a disability, condition, illness. Um, and it was about helping them to find work. Um, and I worked for a pretty good company called India, so you've got a decent amount of training, few weeks training perhaps, which isn't bad by industry standards, and with good follow-ups. And but I was pitched in, I had a caseload of 100 people more who were living in some of the poorest parts of East London, who had pretty complex lives. And my job was to find as many as I could of that group jobs, and to be decent and respectful to the rest. So that's what I was doing. And obviously you go into it fairly cluelessly. Um, it just at that time, the company I worked for had a pretty good philosophy of just recruiting people with the right values who were kind of bright and good communicators. Um, and so I was in with quite a, a really good band of people who are sort of similar to me. Um, and yeah, so you would see people, they'd come because they um, needed to get a job, and you would work with them. You'd put a plan together. You'd talk about what their dreams were, what their aspirations were, what their motivations were, but also the things that they were facing in their lives. You put that plan together. You'd then try and execute on that plan, and sometimes it would work. Sometimes you would um, go through it, and they would find a job that was meaningful to them, and they would stay in that job, and it would be a great experience. But oftentimes it didn't work that way because lives don't. Um, and that circumstances can change, and so you have to roll with that too. But certainly for me, it's like an experience of helping people in those situations. It's an experience I sort of think every politician should ever have, because actually you really see the impact of policy. You really see um, how much things like a little tweak to a working tax credit can make when people are right on um, the breadline.
Mhm.
But I consider it a real privilege to be able to help people. And it was in those moments of actually the plan coming together and helping people to find work that was absolutely transformative to their lives that I realized that my life's purpose was in this work. Um, I think of a guy called Derek who came to me, and first time he ever came to me, he said he's probably in his mid 50s, late 50s perhaps, and he had neck problems and back problems. But the real reason why he was off work wasn't to do with his physical shape; it was to do with the fact that he had lost a lot of hope, I think, about a
Mm.
better future for himself. And he said, "Oh, Pete, it was interesting. We were in an office in Stratford in East London that overlooked at that time the Olympic site as it was being built, because London had the Olympics in 2012. This
Mm.
would have been about 2008, 2009 sort of time. So you could literally see outside, you could see the Olympic site being built. And so people would say, "Oh, there's no jobs for me, Pete." And I'd say, "Yeah, look out there. The world is coming to Stratford. Change your tune." But Derek, he said, "Oh, Pete," was I did that line, which I used on everyone, kind of. And he said, "Oh, yeah, well, I'm not sure about that because my factory used to be out there, and that was the last time I worked, and they bulldozed it for the Olympic site," which put me back on my heels a little bit. Um, but anyway, so we talked about it. We said, "Well, do you want to work?" He said, "Yeah, I do. I just don't think I ever will again." And I said, "Well, why do you want to work?" Um, and he said, "Well, I quite like working one, but really the answer is, um, I'm ashamed. Like, I've got 4 grandkids, and I'm ashamed to even see them because when it comes around to their birthdays or Christmas, I can't afford presents, and I don't feel like I'm a proper granddad to them, and I can't hold up my head high." And that was, a tough thing to hear. But then we got to work. He said, "Well, what do you want to do?" He said, "I love history." I said, "I love history too." So apart from talking through bits of history and the Romans and such like, we went, "Well, okay, well, let's try and find you a job working in a museum." So we wrote to every museum in sort of reasonable public transport radius of his house, and he eventually ended up getting a job at the Greenwich Maritime Museum,
Mm.
uh, doing sort of light janitorial work, which he said was fine in this condition. He was all right with that, um, and he loved it. He absolutely adored it. He loved seeing I particularly love seeing like the sort of groups of school kids coming along as part of their tours. And he just thought, "Yeah, I'm part of that. I'm part of kids learning about history, which is something I'm so passionate about." But the moment where it really came through to me was when he sent me a photo of him and his grandkids at Christmas with their presents. It's just like that. If you can, if I do anything in my life, I've done that, right? And
Yeah.
you hope to do that more times over than that, and then you move into other roles, and you want to set the conditions where that can happen more often. But that kind of moment was a moment when I found my purpose because I realized that was just a spectacular privilege to have been part of that journey.
So does he realize today how much not only did you helped him, but he helped you?
Yeah, well, actually, the latter one, I don't know. I think certainly I would talk to him about that. I'd say, look, things like this are the reason why I get out of bed in the morning,
Yeah.
why I try so hard. Um, and thank you for that. But perhaps, yeah, perhaps there is a point there actually. It was a mutual thing. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to really specialize in that and really help people find jobs. What kind of barriers did people throw in your way as you were trying to find these employment opportunities? I'm sure employers were oftentimes very skeptical and so on, as is usually the case.
Yeah, employers, frankly, so we're talking about 15 years ago is when I was on the front line. But yeah, we've not moved that forward that far since, or or far at all, really. I've moved across the world and found some of the same issues, which is, I think, it's easy to go to blame employers, and sometimes I do. But I think also what we need to really do is look at um, everything that causes that to be the case. Certainly, one of the things that you hear from employers is, "Oh, it's just going to be too hard. This is going to be extra effort for me. I don't need extra effort. I don't need burden." Uh, to which you point out, why do you assume that? Um, we actually have things that we can do to make this easier. And in the case of someone like Derek, there'll be a massive asset to your workforce, and you have those arguments. But that's even if you get to the point where you can make those points to a decision maker. Ultimately, the problem is that institutionally, so many employers are set up not to make a commitment to disability employment. One of the worst things that we've seen, talking about the last 15, 20 years, one of the worst things that we've seen is the over professionalization of HR and recruitment. So if you say, right, I'm going to be very specific about the box that the person must fit in order for them to get to an interview and eventually get the job. Well, unfortunately, a lot of the time that specificity rules out diversity. In fact, the two things are inherently diametrically opposed sometimes. So actually, it's a systematic exclusion is the big problem that I see, and obviously that goes to employers, but it also goes to society, education in general. We've got to desegregate, and we've got to address those systematic issues. So if we're going back to, well, what did I hear from employers in that era? What do I hear from employers now? It's really the result of the systematic thing. So you hear, "Oh, I don't have anyone with disability in my workforce, so I don't know that I'm set up to do it." I'm like, "You definitely do. You just don't. You just haven't set up a situation where people feel psychologically safe to disclose, and you've not asked probably. Um, but you will have people in your workforce who've got disability,
Yeah.
and if they think that, then you get to a point where being diverse and being inclusive isn't normalized. It feels weird to people. It feels alien. And so therefore they don't think, oh, actually, it's relatively simple to employ someone like Derek or someone like Michael or someone like Peter, because actually they have a pretty good idea about how we can work with them to tailor the job to what they need. There's almost a mythology that creeps up around it. So you need to demythologize that. You need to normalize. So I think there's all sorts of barriers that get thrown in the way. The reality is employers aren't doing enough, but perhaps that's also a result of factors that are we as society or as government doing enough also to address those systematic issues.
Yeah.
So it is a complex and thorny one, but I think it's something that we all need to do better with.
Well, it's interesting to to talk about this and to hear what you're saying, um, because it is easy to get very frustrated at employers, but we all know that they're just as much a part of society and were raised and brought up buying into certain myths that aren't really true. But
Mm.
the other part about it is, however, that CEOs and so on often start their companies because they have a vision. And the problem is they don't carry that vision over to other things other than just whatever it is that they're creating or doing. So they don't vision having people who are different becoming part of their workforce, even though the
Mm.
value that is brought by a person with disability is tremendous, such as we know how hard it is to get a job. We know the unemployment rates and how serious they are. And so if we get a job, we really are pretty grateful overall to wanting to make sure we keep that job.
Well, that's right, Michael. I mean, and what's been your experience? Obviously, um, you're from America. It's a different economy. It's a different culture from Australia or Britain that I've worked in. What's been your experience of employers and maybe some of the barriers they might have put in your way?
I think the attitudes are really the same. That is, people are overall not nearly as excited about hiring people with disabilities because, as I describe it, people think that disability means a lack of ability, and we've got to get away from that.
Yeah.
Disability is a characteristic, and we all exhibit it in our own ways, whether we are blind in a wheelchair or sighted and rely on light to be able to function. Disability is something that we all have in one way or another. It's a characteristic that everyone on the planet has. And until we get people to recognize that disability does not mean a lack of ability, and that just because some of us are different than others, it doesn't mean that we can't do the job. We're going to continue to have these problems wherever we are in the world.
I think that's right. Um, and I think I mean, there's a couple of points that I'll make to that. One is I think we need to bring up our kids better when it comes to actually understanding that point. Um, I think, I've had it before where you've been walking through, um, shopping centre and someone will say, you'll see a kid saying, "Oh, look at that, look at that wheelchair. I want to go out and ask the person about the wheelchair." Um, and their mum will be like, "Oh no, don't, absolutely don't, no, 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 taboo, taboo."
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's not healthy.
No, it's not at all. It promotes the fear.
It promotes the fear. It promotes that person's alien. They're different from us in a way that I think a lot of other ways wouldn't be tolerated. you know, if an employer says, "I don't want to employ this person because they're disabled," would they be allowed to say that if it was because they're black? No,
Hmm.
they wouldn't.
Mm-mm.
Well, they very well or not to be saying that, but they would be seen immediately as being racist. But people will say that openly about people with disability, and that's bigotry. And with all bigotry, I'm afraid, you've got to start with the way that we're educating our kids, the way that we talk about it as a society and as a community. So you got to start there. And the second one is, and I think it's why the education is so important, because something I think a lot about is, well, what should government be doing, particularly with employers, to put a thumb on the scale? Because as far as I'm concerned, the kind of just let employers gradually engage with this subject hasn't worked. Like it's going too slowly. Like in Australia, the rate of disability employment, it's maybe shifted a little, but it's not shifted much over a couple of decades of investment into it. And why is that? It's because we have too little expectation of employers. So I think a lot about what should government be doing to, a bit of a carrot and a stick approach, right? So, but if you go with the stick, what I worry about is, let's say you go, as some countries do, let's put quotas in place. That you have to have, in America, you'd probably call it affirmative action, right? You have
Hmm.
to engage with this. You have to do it. And my worry is that if we haven't educated society enough, when you do that, it's quite counterproductive because it breeds a certain resentment. Um, and I think, if you feel, oh, someone got the leg up into the job only because of a quota, that can be problematic. So I think
Hmm.
about, well, actually, you have to do, if you're going to do something like that, you have to do the education piece around it. And that also goes to people with disability around actually knowing that it's okay if you're doing the leveling of the playing field. And I think back to, I mentioned the 16-year-old me earlier. And um, so being dyspraxic, it meant that, I did exams, and I'm old enough that when I did exams, it was handwritten exams. That was what was expected in the UK, and my handwriting is absolutely atrocious. I struggled to write legibly, but
See, you
nevertheless,
should have been you should have been a doctor.
apart from my lack of ability of all things scientific, sure. Um, but yeah, my team often sort of like, oh my gosh, they see me. I'll go to the whiteboard to write something on it, and it'll be impenetrable to anyone but me, right? But because of that, they give me an extra half an hour on exams if I wanted it. So they come around at the end of every exam and they'd say, Pete, do you want the extra half an hour? Every single time I said no. Why did I say no? One, because I didn't want other people to think that I got great good grades because I had extra time,
Hmm.
that I had a leg up. And two, I didn't want me to think that.
Hmm.
I didn't want myself to go, well, I only succeeded because and now I reflect on that and go, well, all they were trying to do there was level the playing field. But you have to acknowledge that in leveling the playing field, might have to sit uncomfortably with the fact that to other people, it might look like you're getting an unfair advantage.
Yeah,
So these are all the things I think about when I think about, well, how does the government put its thumb on the scale in a way that brings society with it, in a way that the attitudes move in a positive way, rather than we just set it up as a kind of zero sum, um, resentment building kind of process.
yeah. Well, and um, we really need to understand what equality and leveling the playing field is all about. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
In colleges today, well, first of all, in this country, yeah, you really probably couldn't get away with saying, "Well, I can't hire you because you're disabled or you have a disability," because of the Americans with Disabilities Act. In fact,
Mm.
there's a television show that's been on here for several years called "What Would You Do?" and it's hosted by a guy named John Quinones on ABC television. And the idea behind the show was they would put actors in situations and portray different kinds of scenarios to see how the people around them behaved. And so my favorite is still there is one where two deaf actresses, and it was in part their idea, came into a coffee shop. Well, so they were just deaf students from Rochester Institute for the Deaf, but they came into this coffee shop and there was an actor who played the barista. And what they did is they came up and they said they wanted a job, and his role was to consistently say, I can't hire you, I'm not going to hire you. And they say, why? Well, because you're deaf, you can't hear what I say. And just you can imagine all the things that he would say, I can't hire you. And finally, and some people looked daggers at him, and a few people really reacted pretty violently about it. But one group of three HR people pulled him aside and said, look, you're handling this all wrong. You can't say that the person's deaf. Well, but the person's deaf, but you can't say that. They have more rights than we do. What you do is you accept the application, then just write not a fit and file it.
Yeah.
you know and those are HR people. The reality is that, so what they're saying is it's open discrimination that they weren't practicing, as John Quinones pointed out. But the problem is it does happen all too often, and it does still continue, and we still have any number of cases that are litigated to try to deal with it. But it ultimately comes down to we're not including people with disabilities and the subject in life conversations. We're still feared. We're not looked at the same way other people are. And so we're not included. And as a result, we continue to see the fear promulgated, like you said about the mother saying, don't talk to that person in the wheelchair, to the child. I've seen that happen a lot.
Yeah.
And my wife, who was in a wheelchair her whole life, experienced the same thing.
And I'm sure she'd have loved to have been asked by a small child, to start to sort of break down those barriers.
Yeah, we're not breaking it down nearly as much as we can or should. I mean, look how fast we started dealing with LGBTQ and other things. Although there's and of course there the backlash of the people who hate that, but still, it's at least being talked about. It's at least out in the open. And we're almost to the end of October, which is National Disability Employment Awareness Month.
Mm.
And I have yet to see on any of the major TV networks and the news or on any of the shows discussions about it. And that's what happens every single year.
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, it's a really in Australia. We're actually, I think we're having an important moment. It's still not as prominent as I'd like it to be. But what we've just had is we just had what we call a royal commission here, and that's sort of the big, well-funded commissions um, that happen every few years into critical issues. And this one was what we could, the shorthand for it is the Disability Royal Commission, but it was really looking at the whole piece around exclusion and exploitation and abuse of people with disability in the system.
Mhm.
And the reason why it's an important moment is because that Royal Commission reported down that Australia is systematically excluding people with disability from mainstream life. And that results in some terrible things. It certainly results in the kind of things we've been talking about in terms of, what worse economic outcomes, but it also involves in things like people being absolutely abused in the system.
Mhm.
So, and it's harrowing to think about. It's harrowing to read, but it's important. But you've got to name the problem before you start dealing with it. And the problem is the systematic exclusion.
Mhm.
So a number of things are going to come out of that report as they're forming a task force on the back of it. There are some, the headline thing is the desegregation of education, which will sort of happen over the coming decades, but it's not easy to change it. But obviously, that's about getting rid of dual systems of schooling and properly funding inclusive schooling within mainstream education. But there's also things there like the ending of sheltered workshops where people with disability are paid to do are made to do sort of, it's a job, but it's at a rate far less than national minimum wage
Yeah.
and to do very routine jobs. So there's things like that, but also there's things that sort of I think hit on the immediate world of disability employment too. So I see this as a moment where everyone in Australia can say, actually, we know because a $600 million review has happened into the way that we treat people with disability in Australia, and that fundamentally the way that we treat people with disability is a disgrace.
Mhm.
And let's start changing that. Let's let this be the moment where we say, that was the moment when the government pivoted, where society got on board, and we changed things for the better. And those things, unfortunately, you can't change the way that society, others, and thinks about people with disability as being alien and all those kinds. You can't do it overnight, but the best way to do it is to name it and to start working on it. So, to all those points around um, how do we start doing it? I think actually calling it out for what it is and then moving on from there is an important moment for Australia.
I think that is definitely a good start. And one of the things that I think would be very helpful is if the commission, as they're going through and talking about solutions, would make sure that part of what they do is include disability education in the school system. We've got to start teaching children about it. And we've got to start teaching children not to fear disabilities, not to fear people with disabilities, and to understand all it really means is they're different.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think the desegregation of schools is part of that. But you're right. But to train kids to do that, you also you need to train their teachers to think like that. You need to train their parents to think like that. And I think you're right. It's exactly that. It's about going, well, actually, we're all different. We all have different things that we bring to the table. We all have different challenges. Um, don't um, don't other people don't go, oh, just because someone's in a wheelchair, that's their defining characteristic. It isn't.
It isn't.
It's
It
their
isn't
way.
at
It's
all.
their way. It's their way of getting round.
It
It's
is
their way
part
of
of what makes them who they are, but it's just a part. Just like
yeah,
short people um, aren't going to make great centers in basketball, or probably not unless they can jump really high. But the reality is that we all have gifts, and we all need to be able to use the gifts that we have, and it's important to recognize that. I've talked several times on this podcast about how I say everyone has a disability, and for most people, you're light dependent. If the power goes out, you guys are in a world of hurt until you find a new light source. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a disability. It's just that mostly because we've really concentrated on making light on demand part of our lives, you don't generally have the problem. But I've seen it happen all too often where the power goes out and people don't know what to do. They start screaming, and they may or may not find
yeah.
a flashlight or a smartphone to turn on to get light, but that's the first thing they want to do is to get light. I don't need to do that.
No, no, and that might might have been one of the reasons why when you were there in the Twin Towers, you actually were able to deal with things calmly. Uh,
Well, not really, because we had power and lighting all the way down. The
yeah.
reason that I was able to deal with it was that I learned what to do in an emergency, and I learned it so deeply and so well that it created a mindset in me. Because I was imagining all sorts of things above us when we saw people coming down the stairs past us who were burned and so on.
Mm,
We could only imagine what was going on up above. But, I was on the south side of the building when it was hit on the north side, and the building was hit 18 floors above us. So as people always say, well, of course you didn't know, you couldn't see it. Excuse me, nobody could. Superman
yeah.
and X-ray vision are not real yet. And the fact is, as we were going down the stairs, nobody knew what was going on. I was the first one with a group near me that figured out we were smelling something, and I figured out it was the fumes from burning jet fuel. But what we still didn't really know. And the reality is, it's not a matter of eyesight, but for me, getting down was all about having knowledge. I didn't rely on needing to read signs to know what to do. I already
Yeah.
knew what to do.
You and that is an example of how um you had a strength. You're prepared, which I think again it goes to how different people have different challenges and different strengths because
Yeah.
of who they are.
Yeah.
Um and that strength saved lives. So, it's an incredibly powerful and potent example of that. And I think when we think about the workplace, um, and again, it's about understandings of disability. Sometimes when I speak to employers and they go, "Oh, right, well, I don't have anyone working here with disability because I don't have anyone in a wheelchair." And I say, "What? Well, only 4% of people with disability need a wheelchair. That's just like one element."
Yeah.
And and so, and they go, "Oh, well, I don't want, or they might say, "Oh, well, I'm disability accessible. I've put in ramps everywhere." And I'm like, "Good. I'm glad you've put in ramps everywhere. Good stuff." However,
Yeah, exactly.
that is not it. And then the conversation might go, "Well, actually, what is the most important thing that we can do to be inclusive to people with disability?" And I say, actually, it's about approach. It's about attitude. It's about, well, actually, am I going to do exactly what you said, which is take people as they come and say, well, what are you good at? And what are the things that we're going to need to think about in terms of the way that we manage you? So you might get somebody, I've had this in a job because I always have that conversation. I say,
Yeah.
how can I help you to thrive in work? What can help you flourish here? And someone might say, well, look, I'm basically fine, but I do get quite acute stress and anxiety.
Hmm.
And here's the times when that happens. These are my triggers. So one of it might be doing a big presentation. And so then you get into a real conversation about how to manage someone. It's not really about disability, although you might, if it's significant enough, it might be classed as a disability. It's based about how to manage somebody within their full self. So this person might say, well, actually my trigger's a big presentation. So you said, right, okay, so are we avoiding big presentations then? No. But what I might need is a day free before that, clear, to make sure I'm absolutely 100% prepared, because that will
Hmm.
mitigate my anxiety. Okay. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to block out your diary for a day before each of those big presentations. That's fine. And I think that, it's that point around actually just managing the whole person, saying you can bring your whole self to work. You got some great strengths that we want to maximize. You got some challenges that we need to think about, mitigate, whatever. And that's the biggest change that most employers can make. And so actually that's the biggest workplace adaptation that you can make. And I think that's one of the main things that I'm saying to employers. And then they go, "Oh, I can do that. That's
Well,
fine. That I can do that." Well, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah. Well, and the other thing it seems to me is if I found a person who was very stressed out because they were afraid of doing big presentations and they needed a day to prepare, but then they came in and did the best presentation I ever saw,
Mm,
I would want to start giving that person more big presentations and more days to prepare, because eventually they're going to realize they don't need a day to prepare anymore. They're used to doing it, which is
yeah.
another part of the process. People always say one of their biggest fears is public speaking. And I'm sure people would say to me, well, you're not afraid because you can't see the audience. Look, my first presentation after September 11th was 2 weeks and a day later. I had been invited to speak at a church service in central New Jersey. And I asked the pastor how many people were going to be at this outdoor service. 6,000. I knew the number. I knew what that meant. Don't tell me about whether I can see them or not. I knew they were there, but it didn't matter because I was used to talking to people in a variety of different kind of public situations. But I realized that a lot of people are afraid of public speaking because that's what they've been taught. That's what they've been told. It's one of our greatest fears, and we've got to get away from doing so much to teach people how to be afraid.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. Teaching people how to be afraid, but also teaching people that difference is something to be afraid of. I mean, the whole of human
Yeah.
history is a litany of being afraid of difference and then acting in terrible ways because of it.
Hmm.
Um, to get to the point about politics, like who are the politicians who I least like, without meaning to get too political,
Yeah.
it is those who seek to amplify those divisions or create new divisions where none existed.
Right.
That is the most awful thing that people can do, and unfortunately, it's still wielded as a weapon like that to this
Yeah.
day. I suspect the next US presidential election, that's going to be a big part of it. And the more that we do that, the harder we're going to be able to get away from this actual, where we need to get to is this communal sense of we are all people. We're all here trying to live good lives. Doesn't matter whether you've got a disability, what the color of your skin is, any of those things. That um, we are all different, and that is good. It is not bad. And I think getting to that realization runs to the heart of where disability employment is, which is disability employment is good. Being an employer where you have a diverse staff is good. I can show you the numbers, but really, I want you to believe it in your heart more than I want you to believe it in your mind, because that's where real change happens.
And that's where we have to go. We have to recognize that part of the cost of doing business should and is inclusion, whatever that means. I mean, we provide coffee machines for people, we provide monitors for people. The National Federation of the Blind is the largest consumer organization of blind people in the United States. And they pay a hefty electric bill every month at the National Center in Baltimore, Maryland, for the sighted people who work there to be able to have lights.
Yeah.
Those of us who are blind And those who work there who are blind don't need the lights, but the other people do, the light dependent people. So, whose disability are we providing an accommodation for? The
Yeah, it's
reality
nice
is
of them
it
to
goes
make
across
that
the board.
workplace adaptation. Yeah, good of them
Yeah,
to make the workplace adaptation for the sighted, I think. Yes,
it
good
is.
point.
It's a reasonable accommodation for sighted people who are light dependent. So I love to use light dependent instead of sighted people because that's the disability that we have to deal with for all of you. And it is still, something that is so rarely really discussed. But speaking of differences and so on, what decided to take you away from London to Australia?
Um, the short answer is love, which is the best answer, isn't it? Yeah, my wife's Australian,
Ah,
so um, and admittedly, we met in the UK. Both work for the company I work for there. It just is an Australian company. Both work there, and um, so we got together there, and then eventually we got to the point of having family and that kind of thing. And it's really, well, where do you want to bring up your family? Um,
mm-hmm.
and for us, Australia is great, great place to bring up your family. You got good weather. We're in walking distance from the beach. It's a great place to bring up kids. And I was also offered the opportunity to move. I was sort of on the lookout, and a mate said, it's always mates for me in the stories, isn't it? A mate said, uh, "Oh, there's a job out here with your name on it, Pete, which is sort of heading up strategy for a not for profit, which had significant disability employment services. So that was part of what I was looking at. But also there was other things that I was doing too, which I was quite enjoying when I was there. Um, Including I set up, obviously in Australia we had the terrible bushfires uh,
Mm-hmm.
4 years ago now. Um, you know, Burned a huge amount of land
Yeah.
and scarred families, economies, and there's a certain part of southern New South Wales, particularly where I did quite a lot of work for my previous employer, and the trauma that's there from that entire experience is absolutely palpable. And so, being part of a not-for-profit that had a significant presence in that world, they're headquartered. Camel Page, the company was, and they're headquartered in Batemans Bay, which is right at the heart of where the bushfires hit. Um, and we thought, well, let's try and do something positive. So what we did was we set up a social enterprise, which was about doing bush regeneration, giving jobs and training to really disadvantaged people, mainly young people, but not exclusively in that area. But there was a lot of big bush regeneration to be done, a lot of planting, a lot of just work to make it a healthy landscape again. And so yeah, that was where we got some good funding in to do that. Um, we pivoted to the big commercial social enterprise too, and so that was something I really enjoyed too. The idea of becoming more of a job creator as well as just um, an advocate for disability employment. Actually, job creation was great, and also we had a very diverse team there. Physically, it was hard to get people with sort of major physical uh, conditions into bush regeneration jobs, but certainly people with pretty significant learning disabilities, uh, psychosocial conditions, etc. And there's opportunity for them to learn the craft of how you look after the land around you, how you connect to that land and strengthen it. And so that was something which I did when I was there that I really enjoyed.
So what's the organization that you work for now?
So now I work for an organization called Disability Employment Australia. So I've been CEO there for about 8 or 9 months now. Um, and our job is to represent, well, I always think that we have sort of two key sort of stakeholders in this. So the first is we are the industry association for providers of disability employment services in Australia. That includes those who deliver what we call DES, the Disability Employment Service, but also other services such as the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And then our core beneficiary, which is, of course, people with disability, um, making sure that we are holding the government to account um, when it comes to um, making sure that it's doing all the right things in terms of policy settings for people with disability. And importantly, that we're leading the charge when it comes to doing things like getting employers to engage. um, with diversity and inclusion. So yeah, that's who I work for now.
Wow. So you sound like you really love it. And do you get to influence the government a lot because of what you do?
I'd like to think so. Uh, it's we certainly have the ear of government, of ministers, and their departments. So yes, I think we have a pretty good voice to government, and there's lots of uh, relatively important things where we've been influential. So if you look at, say, the Royal Commission report that I was referencing earlier, there's quite a few things in there that we at Disability Employment Australia have been advocating for, like the institution of a Disability Employment Centre for Excellence, like there's some technical things around the level of mutual obligation, which is effectively sanctions regimes that people with disability have if they don't engage, which we are in favour of limiting. Uh, Also, things like eligibility for support from government we're quite influential in. So yeah, I think we have the ear of government. We're just a small organisation though, so we need to punch above our weight. Uh,
Mhm.
but also we importantly have very good relationships with our members, so we are able to be quite influential in um, helping them to collaborate and to work on things that are cross-sectoral. So, for example, we are currently about to launch a new training module, which is a micro credential for all disability employment professionals in the field in Australia. So we're doing quite a lot to um, raise the standards in our industry too.
Were you involved in doing any of the work with the commission, or how did you have input to help that?
Yeah, so they had a series of hearings and consultations, as well as opportunities to put in submissions. Uh, and DEA did testify at those hearings and provided a lot of submissions around these issues of employment. Obviously, employment is only one relatively small element of what they were
Right.
looking at. They were looking at it from a whole systems perspective. But yeah, so DEA were part of that, and we're constantly making policy submissions on other items. So we have something called the National Disability Insurance Scheme here. It's a major thing. Which funds supports for people with disability, lifelong disability, where they get effectively chunks of funding that they can administer and spend on the things that they need to live a more um, independent and happy life. And there's many great things about that scheme. Uh, we're supportive of it, but it's been something that's been implemented over the last decade, and it certainly has uh, some improvements that can be made. And some of those improvements, for example, are in the world of employment and how actually claimant to, participants in the NDIS can receive more support, better support when it comes to employment. So that's the kind of thing which we're making policy submissions into a lot.
What kind of global lessons global lessons that we can learn from what you're doing, or just global lessons in general that you feel that we need to tell the world more about and encourage the world to adopt?
But I think there's two things I'll talk about there. One is I think we probably need to get a bit better at sharing. Um, it's funny because I speak to people like you, Michael, or colleagues from other countries in the world, and we're dealing with the same things. Especially in those kind of Western style developed economies, right? So, I went to the World Association of Support and Employment Conference in Vancouver in June of this year, and I was struck by the similarities and the fact that actually workforce participation rates, people with disability, are consistently in that sort of mid-50s type range. I think I'm slightly better in America actually, but it might be due to the way that you count unemployment. But there's a lot of similarities there we need to share. So one thing I'm quite excited about is I am on the board of the World Association of Support and Employment, and in 4 years' time, the global conference is coming to Australia. I need to work out which city we're going to host it in, but it's coming to Australia. So that's a good example of where we can collaborate. But in terms of the lessons of what works, and global literature review and speaking with colleagues and that kind of thing, the big thing I would say is that you can talk all you like about technology and all sorts of whizzo innovations, but the reality is there's nothing more powerful than humans helping humans. That's the reality. Is if you've got somebody who needs a bit of support to find a job, to overcome their challenges, having somebody who's got a bit of expertise, who really cares, who wants to build a relationship, and they share that journey together, that is the most important thing that you can do. Obviously, there are variables in there, like how well trained are the staff, how experienced are they? Do you have access to some technology that maybe helps that job search work better? How are your relationships with employers? All those things count. But most important of all is, have you got a really committed human helping that other human? Because that's where you see transformations get made.
We've talked a lot about attitudes, which I think is absolutely appropriate and probably the biggest thing we face. But at the same time, what's the role of technology in disability employment and making it better, do you think?
I think it's a really interesting question, and one that I'm grappling with. I think you look at any of the sort of papers about the future directions of economies, etc., and you see, oh well, these higher skilled jobs, AI, all that kind of thing. And I think AI certainly is an opportunity because um, the ability to work within those systems is not restricted to geography. Um, so I think that's something which, as it evolves, could be a really great thing for people with disability who want work. Also, it can do things like over time it will improve things like job matching and all that kind of thing to take a bit of the friction out of that system. But I think the biggest development, and one which I hadn't necessarily foreseen, is the flexibility that workplaces are now taking, primarily because the pandemic happened. Um, it's funny. You spend years talking to businesses about actually you can change your business model. You can be more flexible. You can use remote working more. And they go, no, no, too hard. No, if we need to do that, it would be a 5-year change management project. And then the pandemic happens,
Yeah.
and then and they do it within 2 weeks.
And I was
It's
going to ask you
unbelievable.
about that, whether you thought that the pandemic made a significant difference in disability employment and just the world in general. And you're talking about that. Go ahead.
I think so. I think it has, because I think it means that the idea, I mean, it's a couple of things. Firstly, more people are working at home. I'm calling in, I can see you're in your house, I'm in my house. 5 years ago, at least I would have been in my office, right? So the fact that we're now working that hybrid way or the remote way certainly erodes the importance of geography in a way which I think is important for people with disability and was important for everyone, frankly. And that's a pretty big change.
Mhm.
However, one of the things around that I think about quite a lot is that, firstly, it tends to apply more to people who already have a job. So actually, there's a relatively small percentage of jobs that are advertised with flexibility in there compared to the number of jobs which actually are done flexibly, if you know what I mean. So if you're in a job and you say, right, okay, can I have an extra day a week to work at home? Lots of employers will accommodate that. However, they won't necessarily advertise the fact that they're
Hmm.
willing to do that. So the other thing is around um, the types of jobs. So obviously, people with disabilities do all different types of jobs, but the ones who are unemployed tend to go in at those relatively low levels, not exclusively by any means, but tend to. Um, and then you hope there's the opportunity to build up from there. But again, those jobs which are at the relatively low levels tend to be the ones with less flexibility. Um, I think it's notable that, we talked a lot around the sort of key personnel, key service workers during COVID. And a lot of the ones, those were people who are badly paid but have to be present. And I think there's a reality there which we need to think through a little bit more about how the benefits of flexibility can accrue to people working at all levels of the labour market. and how we can also be upfront, advertise flexibility as a component of the role rather than something that has to be asked for once somebody's in the role.
Yeah. Well, and the problem is, I see both sides of that because there are all too many people who try to take too much advantage of things, and so it is an issue. But at the same time, we do need to recognize that there is a value in being more flexible than we have. Um, and I think we're seeing more that in reality, it's a good thing to let people have some time to work at home, less stress. So many things happen if you do that right.
Yeah, absolutely. And for all sorts of reasons. In my personal case, it gives me more time with my kids.
Yeah,
Takes
exactly
me
right.
more than an hour to get into the city. Yeah, that's 3 hours each day that I get back to spend with my children. Like that's, your kids aren't young for long.
Right.
That's massive for me. So there's huge advantages, and that's great for my well-being, which makes me a more productive worker bee. So there's huge advantages to do that. Yeah, I mean maybe people might take advantage sometimes. But if you're a good boss, you have an understanding of the output of um, people working for you, and you understand what acceptable looks like and what non-acceptable looks like. I think.
Well, and that's
Um,
the issue,
so-
right? If you're a good boss, you deal with the people who are taking advantage of it, um, and hopefully they grow to understand.
yeah, that's right. And you can you can always have a look at the way that you extend the flexibility. But overall, I think that is a massively important part of what's happened over the past 5 years. But also, we should not ignore that lesson of how quickly employers can pivot if they need to.
If they need to.
Um, yeah, or those businesses like the ones that make gin, who are making hand sanitizer within a week of having to do it. Like
Yeah.
when they need to, when there's an economic imperative to do so, and businesses can change fast. So, what's the implication for disability employment? One is around flexibility, but the second is if you really wanted to pivot to being a fantastic, inclusive employer of people with disabilities, you could change quickly.
Yep.
It's not this thing that needs a 5 year change management project, actually.
Yeah. I agree. What are your hopes for the future in terms of disability employment type services and so on?
I am hopeful, um, and I think we have to be in the kind of work that we do. So, from an Australian perspective, it is to that point which I made earlier around there is a moment here where we have admitted what the problem is, and that problem is systematic exclusion.
Hmm.
If we start from that premise and start building from that premise, I think there's a lot of hope. If we go, well, actually, what we need to do, exactly as you say, is address education and awareness and attitudes. That's a great start. If we start desegregating ourselves, that would be these are the things that are actually the building blocks to changing the way that disability employment works. Beyond that, I think I have a moment, and the kind of people I work with in my movement, to really lobby government about making substantive change that will change the prospects of people with disability when it comes to employment. So this point around, can I get to the government and say, right, you need to put the thumb on you need to put your thumb on the scale when it comes to employers and how much they're engaging. That conversation is now open. When I go to the, government and say, you need to be better employers of people with disability. Your rates of employed people with disability are pitiful. Well, they are going to need to change. So I think we are at a moment now, certainly in Australia, where we've named the problem. We know that it can't be swept under the carpet and we can start dealing with it. So that makes me very hopeful for the future. Globally, it's a classic case of, the what's that Martin Luther King quote about the arc of moral justice being long, but it doesn't always
Yeah.
run in a straight line.
Right.
I think that's I think that's where we're at. Like I think we are moving towards degrees of progress, but it's slow. My hope is that we can use moments like the one that we have in Australia at the moment to accelerate that, to move down the curve further, faster. Um, And I think there is certainly the opportunity to do that. I don't think people are born wanting to discriminate against others because of their disability or ability. I think that's learned, and we need to unlearn it, and we need to unlearn it fast. So I do have lots of hope, but I also recognize that this is going to be my life's work and the life of so many others' work, and um, we need to press on because the task is large and it's complex, but it's also incredibly important.
Yeah, well, it is, and I would say anyone who listening, I hope appreciates what you say and what you do, and I hope that we all learn something from it. Have you written any books or anything on the subject?
I've not written any books. No,
I haven't
I've written
written any
lots of
books yet.
submissions. Maybe I need to write an anthology of my policy submissions. Well, that'd be a bit dry. Maybe I'll write one day.
Well, I hope you do because I think it would be well worth having and certainly well worth reading. But I want to thank you for being with us. If people want to reach out to you and engage in some way, how can they do that?
Well, email me. So that's Peter Bacon at disabilityemployment.org.au.
And that's PETERBACON.
BACON, like the delicious breakfast food.
Right. So just Peter Bacon at
.org.au.
disabilityemployment.org.au. There
Yeah.
you go. Well, I hope people will reach out, and I hope that uh, everyone got a lot out of today. I did. I always like to talk about these things, and it helps me always put more things in perspective, and I get to learn what other people are thinking. So I find it very valuable. So thank you for being here with us, and thank you for listening. And I hope all of you out there like this. Please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. We value your ratings and your reviews, so please do it. If you'd like to reach out to me and have any thoughts or opinions, I want to get them from you. Please email me at michaelhi, at accessibe, accessibe.com, or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. And Michael Hingson is MICHAELHINGSON, all one word. Again, please give us a 5-star rating. We value that. Love to hear from you. And I hope that you'll be with us the next time we do Unstoppable Mindset. And Peter, one last time, I want to really thank you for being here. This has been wonderful. And we really appreciate you coming on and Sheldon from Accessibility finding you for us.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that.